So this video is about kind of why here in the New York metro area we had um, we had some of our really strong polar vortexes that we saw here in the New York metro area. And I'm not going to go over the ones in the winter. I'm actually going to go over the ones that happened later on, but why they were still really strong. Like, for example, what happened on Memorial Day weekend of 2021. Memorial Day weekend of 2022 was rather moderate. We only got 3 days off this time, not 4, unlike in 2021. The first day is a bit rainy for Memorial Day weekend, with temperatures going between 62 and 74 degrees. But then the next day, temperatures begin to rise. Lows do get down to the 50s as the humidity clears, but the high does get into the mid-70s with beaming sunshine. Memorial Day itself in 2022 wasn't the hottest day of them all, although it was still pretty miserable, with lows of 60 and highs of 83 with a bit of humidity. At night, it gets down to 70 at 10 o'clock, then it begins to rise as a bit of a warm front comes through that actually, while the humidity began to fold and collapse, temperatures still rush up to 93 degrees here, which is the warmest in May. On May 31st, it was the warmest in May since 2000, and although at least in the city, they did wind up getting to 96 degrees in April of 2002, which is crazy. And it was the middle of April too. It's kind of like that time where New York City got to 93 degrees, and here we got to about 92. In the beginning of October. It reminds you of those times where, you know, those could be the hottest days of the year. And they happen at such unseasonable times. Before on June 1st, a front comes through, which is why the low temperature on May 31st is still 61 degrees, and why the low in the morning is 58, followed by a high of only 66 degrees. Meanwhile, Memorial Day weekend 2021 was quite the opposite. It was similar to Mother's Day weekend 2021, except more notable due to how much later it occurred. On May 28th, after a high of 67 degrees, the low gets to 50 here and 49 in the city. A cold front comes down. It had actually been cooling off over the past few days, but May 28th was only a bit below average. But then the next days, both here and in the city, we have highs of 51 and lows of 47. As the Memorial Day rain and whatever, that air was literally from the North Pole or close to it because of a low pressure system that was over there, assuming that way down there, blocking it, pushing all the cold air into here. That combined with the rain holding down the temperatures is what allowed for it to essentially feel like late March in late May. So below average. So below average. On Memorial Day, it gets to a low of 48 degrees. The high gets 72 in the city, only 67 here because the sun finally begins to clear. And then the next day, parts of the island do get into the 40s. At one point, it was thought where I lived got down to 49. Now they revised the low temperature to be only 51 degrees, which I don't understand. High of 76 here in the city, though the city had a low of only 56 degrees. On June 1st, as a bit of a warm front began to push through, where there was then a brutal June heat wave over the next weekend into Wednesday, before on Thursday, a front finally comes down, cooling the area off. it was actually much different from the last weekend, where both days got into the upper 80s. And made for the coldest Memorial Day weekend on record. If you think about the mean temperatures on May 29th, 30th, and 31st of 2021, it was literally 49 degrees on both May 29th and 30th. And May 31st improves, but it's still like 58 degrees. That's not warm by any metric. Especially when the average mean temperature is 64 degrees this time of year, or that time of year. Now it's even more. Now, in 2022, we have another Arctic outbreak that ushers in snow squalls that kill 6 people. Now, this Arctic outbreak was felt strongest along the northeast corridor, and there were places in the mountains of Vermont that actually saw some fresh snow. That's right, fresh snow. Fall. And some places in upstate wind up being stuck in the 40s. So they don't even make it to 50 degrees. Actually, on that note, fun fact, on June 19th, Caribou, Maine has a record late date where the high fails to hit 50. Because on June 19th, 2022, they failed to hit 50 as a big Arctic outbreak caused near freezing temperatures across much of upstate New York. But down here in the metro area, all we really see is low temperatures getting down to 54 degrees, which while it is below average, it's not the same. And the high temperatures that they still got to 75. But Caribou is also like up in the mountains. But even then, it's still crazy. It allows 1 or 2 people to actually die of hypothermia in June, which I would have never imagined. Meanwhile, in March, this was a serious cold wave, and basically, it again happens the same due to some cold fronts. Although in this case, I remember March 25th was not that warm, but and it couldn't have been humid because the temperature was only in the upper 50s. But I guess so strong, and we weren't really used to it. Even though those times it's happened before, it just felt really hot. It just felt really hot. I don't know why. But then I remember on March 26th, and I remember I thought it was on and off. It was long underneath, so I guess it wasn't that bad. The temperatures kind of stabilized around 50 in the earlier part of the day. Then a cold front comes in where potential hail falls at 3 o'clock. Never mind the fact that the dew point was still close to freezing. Somehow there was still a big thunderstorm that cooled the air off to 44 at midnight and 40 the next morning, actually 39. The high only gets to 46 the next day, and this is March 27th, so the storm was on March 26th, before the temperature crashes down to 31 degrees, so it got below freezing at night. Now, this is below average for March as it is. Now for Memorial Day weekend, I do want to go over that the high-low, at least here, 72.56. In a city, it's a tad bit higher. Probably like 2 to 3 degrees. Take this with a grain of salt. 2 to 3 degrees higher in a city. That sounds about right to me. Now, by this point in March, it's still not really warm by any metric, but it's like 51.37. But below freezing in late March. It's not the rarest occurrence in the world. It's not the rarest occurrence in the world. It happens. I mean, in 2021, after some strong cold fronts, there's a day where it got down to 30 degrees in the, actually, potentially even 29 degrees, I think 29 or 30 degrees, on April 2nd, and April 3rd also gets down to 30 degrees. Although the thing with April 2nd was that the high temperature was 39 and it was at midnight. Maybe it was 40, but it was at midnight. So the afternoon high was only about 37. At least on April 3rd, it begins to warm up and it gets into the 50s. So 2022 would have an earlier last date of hitting freezing, but what happened was a lot worse because in the city, it barely cracked above freezing. It had a low of 22 and a high of 33 on March 28th. Here, while we have similar lows, the high only gets to 32. Plenty of places on Long Island felt it freezing. It's like probably the only time in history where you'll see on dark sky the Long Island map covered in the blue conditions at 4 o'clock or whatever time it was that late in the year. Blue typically means it's from the upper 20s to the upper 30s, I want to say. And then it begins to become a bit more greeny once you get to about 40 degrees. And the next day, March 28th, while it wasn't quite as record-breaking, the low was 23 and the high was like 38 or 39, I want to say. I think 38. So, still cold. The next morning gets down to 27, but there is a high of 45. And for the final day of March, New York City and here, both at lows of 42. The city actually is 66, here it only gets to 58. So a warm front comes through, but on April 1st, there is a thunderstorm that does put the temperature to a bit of a crash. That's the thing, we didn't fully recover from this polar vortex for a week, because then April 1st is a temperature crash the whole day. So by April 2nd, the low gets down to the upper 30s with a high of only 54. The next day it has a low of 40 and a high of like 47 or 48. So it really did take a full week for the polar vortex to recover, and the air, again, it was brought straight down from the North Pole. Now, a lot more infamous is what happened in July, on the 4th of July weekend, July 3rd, because what happened was actually kind of crazy. You had, in New York City, the hottest day of the year, where I got to 98 degrees, was on just June 30th. Here, it only got to 91, and we had a day of 93 in late August. But for New York City, they got to 98. The low is a sultry 80 degrees in the city and 78 here in the morning. But cold fronts puts it down to 74 here and 73 in the city, but maybe 75 here by midnight. The next day has a similar morning low, highs in the mid 80s, and then temperatures which fall to 72 degrees due to another cold front. Then on June 2nd, highs at this point can only get to about 76 or 77, and lows get to 65 due to another cold front. But this one is prolonged. So the high of 64 is felt at midnight, and the temperature slowly begins to decay to 59 degrees, whereas on July 4th, what the hell is he doing? On July 4th, it begins to, again, decay down to like 59 degrees. I think it's a high of 77, which is still below normal, because at that point, you have an average low of 65 and an average high of 81. And again, the temperature over the 4th of July weekend was quite cold, though it would get some warm fronts coming in quickly. New York City has a high of 66, but a low of, again, only 59 on that day. But it's not really talked about as much, even though it felt like early May in the middle of in the middle of summer. I guess the reason why it isn't frequently discussed could be the fact that that these days aren't quite as rare. And they have happened on occasion before, whereas something like, such as it hovering around 50 on Memorial Day weekend isn't quite as heard of, or temperatures struggling to hit freezing by the end of March. In the beginning of March, it's quite typical. By the end of March, not so much. As a matter of fact, 2022's weather so far has been filled with very big temperature swings. January, we're going to use here and not based off New York City. Even though New York City had a low of only 50 degrees on New Year's Day. Can you believe that? Here it was 49. High of 56 in the city, high of 53 here. We both get highs of 59 on January 2nd. A cold front did come through the last night, but guess what? It's delayed. But then, of course, temperatures do fall to 38 by midnight, and then the next day, temperatures get down to 30 in the morning, stay that way in the afternoon. Florida barely misses us. Then it gets down to 23 by night, down to 19, only up to 35. At this point, it's only here, not based off New York City, it's based off where I live. But then January 5th actually gets up to 47 degrees. But then the next day cools off. January 7th, we get a nor'easter with where the snow outperformed. 5.8 inches of snow falls in the city center of New York City itself, but much of Long Island sees 8 or more inches of snow, with the peak amount being 9.3. Now on January 9th, we get a drizzle, which pushes temperatures up to slightly above average at 42 degrees, a low of 25 at midnight. So sounds nice. Oh, and then guess what? Deja vu. High of 40 at midnight, cools off to 29 in the morning, gets up to 30, then cools back down to 23. The only thing is that on this, 26 actually. The only difference is that on this day, 26 at midnight is the high. The actual daytime temperature struggles to get out of the 20s, and it's in the teens in the morning. It's so cold. Someone in my geometry class, it was the only day of the year where they wore pants. They wore shorts every day of the year, except this one, at least when we were in school, due to the extreme conditions. And while the temperature could moderate a bit, it couldn't really. It still struggled to get to even get out of the 30s, which is sad. Though we would get a 48 degree day, actually, that Thursday. And a Friday, we get a relatively warm night. By warm night, I mean 38 degrees, and so not sucky. The high of 43, and then a crashing cold front with a low of 22 at midnight, and winds so strong that by the time it even hits freezing, the wind chill is already 18 degrees. So you can imagine in the next morning when the air temperature gets down to 10 degrees, what it would be like. The afternoon high temperature didn't even escape the teens, and it cooled back to 9 at night. But because of Windstorm Izzy, the temperature gets pushed up by midnight up to 42, with the high at 5 a.m. about 47. Mild-ish conditions throughout the day, and then again another temperature swing. So it tends to be where it gets into the 40s, and then very bad cold wave. Because that happened quite throughout the month. But January was still 3.4 degrees below average. 4.5 if you factor out the first and the second, which was 16 degrees above average. Now, heading into February, there'll be a buildup of warmth. And this warmth would peak when it got to 50 degrees here, 56 in the city on February 4th. But in the early morning hours, the temperature crashed. It crashed all the way down to 37. And the thing with Winter Storm Landon was the storm continued. It wasn't like the front happened when it stopped. It continued. And I'm telling you, raining when it's 36 degrees is horrible. But we got a bit of an ice storm because guess what the temperature was when the storm pulled out? 31. But it was stubborn and refused to convert to snow. So therefore the next day, the high temperature barely hits 30. And the low temperature at midnight decays to 28 degrees. In February 7th, we get like a 37 degree drizzle, which suck. But it allows for a buildup of warmth where eventually we have days where it actually is at 54 degrees. Though the winds are extreme, what made it nice was that it was sunny. You could actually go outside and take a walk and enjoy a 54 degree warmth. It didn't feel like 54 degrees, I will say that. But you weren't in an ice storm. On February 12th, the winds die down and the temperature gets up to 61 degrees, low of 42. Here it gets even warmer than in the city where it can only get to 57 degrees. But take this with a grain of salt. The next day has a high of 42, which occurs at midnight. Then it gets to 32 by the morning, and significant snow begins to accumulate. 1.5 inches in the city and about 4 inches here, I want to say. And this is the day before Valentine's Day as well. Low is decays to 26 by midnight, which would be the high the next day, both at midnight and in the afternoon, as it plunges down to 16 degrees with extreme winds. It was horrible. Horrible conditions. And then a warmth builds up where the low can get from 17 degrees to a high of 44, which occurs late at night on the 16th, and on the 17th the warmth further builds, allowing the city to have a high of 68, and here we get kind of screwed over and we get a high of 56. So when the storm comes, we get to about 55 degrees. New York City gets up to 61. The temperature crash this time occurs more slowly, and thankfully it is in the 40s when a storm pulls out. So I remember when I left school, it was 41 degrees and windy. But it wasn't as bad as the last time because it was still warmer. The decaying temperature would actually finish out at 27, so it would be slightly cooler because this front was stronger, and then we had to fly into Seattle the next day. And guess what we missed? Another big buildup of warmth in temperatures in the 50s until it peaks at a 69 degree temperature both here and in the city. But again, this is a delayed front, and the temperature falls right back down to 37 degrees. Some more interesting temperature swings is like March 5th to 6th to 7th to 8th. On the 5th, you have a low of 26 and a high of 43. On the 7th, a low of 42 and a high of 60. On the 6th, on the 7th, a low of 49 and a high of 60. And then on the 7th, a high of 53 at midnight, and the temperature decays down to 38. And then the next day, there's sleet. 10th and 11th, bit of a build-up in temperatures. The 11th, getting to 52 degrees after a low of 30. So a day where we take our sweatshirt off when we go to a state park. Back then, because of how 52 degrees felt, it feels a lot different now that we're out of that temperature. Now it feels so cold. So cold. March 13th, the temperature gets up to about 46, but then again, a temperature crash back to 23. So the 13th is cold. Then we get 70 degree weather on close to 70 degree weather on on March 18th. Fun fact: New York City actually had a high low of 54.72 on March 7th because again, remember Long Island gets screwed over this time of year. It's really December and March, but it all depends on what's going on and how strong the warm front preceding the cold front is and how far it can penetrate into the island and winds off the water. Then we have that Arctic outbreak. April is full of swings. And in May, it starts out full of swings, but then on Mother's Day weekend, high 51 at 7 a.m., low 45 as it decays, 45 to 58 on Mother's Day, and then May 9th has a low 44 and a high of 69. From there, though, it exits, and there's only one more day in the 40s. The next day, with a high of 71 and a low of 49, though honorable mention May 25th, where the high 66 and the low is 50, especially because that was 3 days after the temperatures near 90.